Hi guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Olivia. Thanks for watching. So with the last two elections, I think that no matter who you voted for or if you didn't vote, one thing we can all agree on is that they were pretty historic. And other than that, they were super exhausting. There has to be a time that politics wasn't so freaking dramatic. That led me to realize that I really don't know anything about any of the other presidents. I could probably name like 6 off the top of my head, probably less, and I know that I am not the only one. So, with all that said, I really wanted to dive into what these presidents were really about. Who the hell were they? How did we get here? So let's start it off with the man, the myth, and the legend, George Washington. And I just kind of thought that it would be fun for me to try to make it through some of these presidents' favorite desserts. So I'm gonna make his wife, Martha Washington's great cake. Let's get started. I preheated the oven to 325, which is what it said to do. This recipe kind of called for a few ingredients that I couldn't find or that I just wasn't willing to spend the money on because I was never going to use them again. So I'm just kind of using what I have and what the store had to try to make my version of Martha's cake. And I hope it turns out well. I kind of have a little bit of a thought that it's gonna be kind of gross, but I'm gonna make it anyway because it's George Washington's favorite dessert, so I'm doing it for George. Last night I let the raisins and the candied fruit and stuff kind of marinate in the wine, so right now I'm just gonna kind of strain that out. While I'm doing that, I'm gonna tell you a little bit about George. George Washington was born in 1732 in Virginia. His dad died when he was 11, so he was kind of forced to grow up a lot faster than a lot of people. At 11, he was kind of like the man of the house. He couldn't go to private school like his half-brothers. He is kind of not embarrassed about, but he's a little bit like insecure about the fact that he didn't really have a great education. And a lot of the other founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, they all kind of had like a snooty little private school education. He didn't let it hold him back. Obviously, he becomes the president. There wasn't that much to drain. So at 21, he's made a major in the army. He's sent by his lieutenant to go and send a message to the French in Ohio Valley. Ohio Valley was kind of like a hot spot for trading goods, and like everybody wanted it. The French, the British, everyone. So his lieutenant sent him to go send a message to France to stop expanding in the Ohio Valley. The French was like, no, we're not gonna stop, make me. So George Washington went home and he wrote about his journey and it got published. So this kind of makes him a celebrity. He's already on his way to becoming a household name. All right. So I strained all the fruits, I got the wine out of it. I'm supposed to add another half a cup of the wine to the wine that I already drained. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do that. Where is half a cup? I don't know. Half a cup's not really on this thing. I'm just gonna use half a cup of this because that's what I used to measure yesterday. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I'm an amateur history buff, an amateur baker, and an amateur adult. So I'm hoping for the best. I'm hoping someone will eat this cake. I got my fruit, so I'm just adding flour into the fruit mix now. So after George Washington is sent to, deliver the message to the French and they refuse to stop their expansion, there was a battle that broke out between the French and the British. So George Washington was obviously in this battle. At the end of this battle, 10 soldiers were dead, 10 French soldiers were dead, and one of them turned out to be a French diplomat. So obviously, this kind of pissed off the French, and this battle kicked off the French and Indian War, sometimes called the 7 Years' War, because it kind of went on for a really long time, 7 years. I'm adding my almonds into this fruit mixture. This is really hard to mix. Now I gotta sift all this flour. Another battle broke out between the French and the British, obviously, because it was a war. So in this battle, George Washington and his troops are pretty outnumbered. Other battles in the war were surrendered, but this is the only one that George Washington was in that he will ever surrender. The French were pretty salty about the fact that George killed their diplomat. So they allowed them to sign a treaty saying that George's troops could all go home safely, but George had to sign something saying that he assassinated this French diplomat. Even though George was forced to sign this thing, he denied that he killed him. Will we ever really know if George Washington really killed that diplomat? No. According to the French, he did. George, at 23 years old, is given command of the Virginia Regiment. He wanted his troops obviously to be taken seriously. He was held responsible and he didn't want to look like a fool. So he whipped them into shape. He trained them and he even designed their uniforms. And I guess to make people want to fight in war back then, you had to really scare them. Obviously in the beginning, some people tried to desert because they didn't want to fight in the war. They tried to run away. What George Washington did to stop this behavior from the others is he hung those soldiers in front of the rest of the troops. So in a letter to his governor, he said, "Your honor will, I hope, excuse my hanging instead of shooting them. It conveyed much more terror to the others, and it was for example's sake we did it." He was making an example out of these people for deserting the army and not fighting. Basically, he was Monica hiring Joey to fire him. I think that would work for me. Adding 1 rough teaspoon of nutmeg. Even though he was a great commander of the Virginia Regiment, even though he did kind of a good job, you know, he designed their uniforms, he made them into a respectable troop, he still couldn't get into the Royal British Army. He kind of felt disrespected by the British Army, especially because, you know, soldiers with lower ranks than him kind of looked down on George Washington. So maybe this is kind of where George Washington kind of felt turned off to the British, kind of planted a little seed in George Washington, if you will. So while all of this has happened, he fought in the war where he had to surrender. He was kind of just like, you know, a soldier. And yeah, he was kind of a celebrity from writing the message to the French, but he wasn't astounding yet, you know. And then the next battle comes. In this battle, his general dies. He has 2 horses shot out from underneath him and 4 bullets kind of pierce his jacket. Like, he should have died, but instead he didn't die, number 1, and he also helped a lot of other soldiers not die. So after this battle, he was a hero. He was Superman. He was Spider-Man. He was every superhero wrapped into one, and he was like the coolest guy ever, I guess, after this battle. And not only was this an important battle for George Washington, it was an important battle for the British Army as a whole, because this was kind of a turning point, and ultimately George Washington helped lead the troops in the final battle that secured the victory for Britain. So after the war, Washington meets his wife-to-be, Martha Custis. This is her cake I'm making. I'm completely butchering it. I'm sorry, Martha. So she inherited like 1,000 acres and 300 slaves and, you know, all this from her husband who recently died. George Washington may or may not have, he may have been a straight up gold digger. A lot of historians kind of agree that he did like Martha, like he liked her. You know, they got along well, but they also kind of agree that the money, it didn't hurt at all. Is it fair to say that he was kind of a gold digger? This is all speculation, but I think so. I want to mention that George Washington also proposed after only meeting Martha like 3 times. Go Martha, like you had a lot of money. You were the richest woman in Virginia. My measuring cup broke. My mom's gonna be really upset. I kind of watch cooking shows, but I'm not a cook, guys. I'm not a cook. This is for entertainment purposes only. Oh, no. Oh, shit. There was also some rumors that George Washington was also kind of into this other lady named Sally Fairfax. She was married to George Washington's friend, so they couldn't be together. So sad, but they wrote some steamy letters. He wrote her some words, but ultimately he married Martha, and it worked out great. They were married until the day George Washington died, like 40 years later. So I'd call that a successful marriage, wouldn't you? Martha Washington traveled with George Washington when he was in the army. So this was going on for years. She kind of became his confidant, like she was his best friend. He would also share like a lot of war stuff with her. She would plan social gatherings. She would like make meals, and you know, she kind of set the precedent for what a modern day military wife is. You know, she gave up a lot, she sacrificed a lot, but she supported her husband. And I know military wives don't typically travel with their husbands now. Her sacrifice and the way she acted about it kind of set a precedent for, you know, military wives now. Go Martha. I'm messing up your cake. I'm sorry. So what happens next? He's married. He just fought in the French and Indian War. He's now a national hero. He's a celebrity. Everyone loves him. After the war, Great Britain is broke. They're out of money because this war was so expensive. And even though they won, they're kind of financially ruined. So they're trying to find out a way to get money. And the way they figure out is to tax America. Obviously, America is not having it. They're like, no taxation without representation. George Washington was pretty vocal about this. Is he a little salty about not being able to get in the British Army? Probably. Got my half cup. So all of this taxation leads to the Boston Massacre, which leads to the American Revolution. So because George Washington was so great in the French and Indian War, they make him the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army for the American Revolution. So they offer him a $500 a month salary, and he turns that down. And I think that he also turns down the salary that he got for president. So they make him the commander-in-chief of this Continental Army. He accepts, but he also has some self-doubts. And I think that that's where his insecurity for his education really comes into play. He says, "But lest some unlucky event should happen unfavorable in my reputation, I beg it may be remembered by every gentleman in the room that I this day declare with utmost sincerity I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." He said this in his acceptance speech. So basically he was saying, look guys, I will do my best, but if this all goes wrong, I told you. So during this time, Washington is with his troops, you know, he's away from the other founding fathers leading the army. They decide to ratify the Declaration of Independence, which is pretty important. Washington is not really in the room for that, but when Washington learns the news and he tells his troops that they are rectifying the Declaration of Independence, they are officially leaving Great Britain, the troops are pretty excited about it. They destroy one of the statues of King George III and they parade around with his head. Later on, that statue is even melted down and turned into bullets. So that's kind of a move, I think, you know, killing your own army with bullets made from your statue. That's pretty good, right? It says to do this by hand. Hurts. It hurts. America loses the battle in Brooklyn, and it's pretty devastating. So George Washington is like, how can we win the next one? He plans a surprise attack. So he crosses the Delaware River. This is that painting of him like on the water. Did you guys know? The one that's in the Met? I sure as hell didn't know that that was him crossing the Delaware River. So he crosses it to surprise these German troops that were paid by Britain to help them fight in this war. I want to mention that France was helping us. We fought France and then France helped us fight Britain, that technically we were fighting for Britain in the last war. Just to clarify. The German soldiers, they're hiding out in Trenton, New Jersey, so that's why George Washington takes his troops and they go sneak up on these German soldiers and they win. They win this battle. It's super important, I guess. They win. This painting has been in the Met since 1897. That's a long time. You good? So after they won the battle in Trenton, then the next most important battle of the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Yorktown, happened. So in this battle, George Washington and his troops, they shot cannonballs at the British for a week. for a week before they even went in with the muskets. It told me to fold this in. Do you guys watch Schitt's Creek?
Oh, next step is to fold in the cheese.
What does that mean? What does fold in the cheese mean?
He folds it in.
It's one of my favorite shows. So they really did tire out the British army, I think. And at this battle, the British surrender, and ultimately the Americans, the rebels, they end up winning the whole war. And you know, in a lot of people's eyes, that couldn't have happened without George Washington. I mean, in everyone's eyes, he was the commander. In everyone's eyes, we would not have won without George Washington. Ew, this is not going to be good. After the American Revolution ends and George Washington helps lead the Americans to victory, he's like, guys, I fought in 2 wars. I helped you win 2 wars. I'm going home. I'm done with public life. I'll stay out of it. I'm going home. All right, George, whatever you say, go home. You're done. You're done with public life forever. George wants to be done with public life, but obviously that doesn't happen. So then the Constitutional Convention happens, and they decide to make George Washington the president of the Constitutional Convention. And shortly after that, they unanimously elect George Washington to be the first president of the United States. He won unanimously both terms. He's the only president to ever have this happen. John Adams came in second, so he became the first ever vice president. And then he made Alexander Hamilton his treasurer, and then he made Thomas Jefferson Secretary of State. George Washington did not even want to do 2 terms. He wanted to be done after 1 term, but he was told that the country would not survive if he didn't stick around. Do you imagine just wanting to go home and they were like, no, we won't survive without you. You're staying. You probably know some employees that work at like the gas station that are like, my job would crumble without me. So when George Washington was president, he kind of did things a little bit different. In 1794, Washington was kind of trying to get money, so what did he do? He pulled out a little trick from the British government. He started taxing whiskey. These farmers in Western Pennsylvania, they didn't want to pay the whiskey tax, and the rebellion kind of went on for years. Like George Washington kind of took it for years, but it was getting a little bit out of control. These farmers even tar and feathered one of these tax collectors, and George Washington was like, all right, that's enough. Playtime's over. So he suited up in his military uniform and he stomped in there on his white horse and he was like, guys, you have to pay this tax. I'm sorry. And these farmers in Western Pennsylvania were like, you didn't have to do all that. All right, we'll pay it. Pay your taxes, people. Pay your taxes. He's the only president ever to kind of lead troops when he's active as president. He's the first and only on-duty troop lead-in president. Don't forget to grease your pan, all right? Do you know how many times in life I've forgotten to grease my pan? If you say it enough times, it sounds weird. Grease my pan. Yeah, so he liked to hear a lot of different people's opinions, and since the 2 people that he has in his cabinet are Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, 2 very opinionated people. If you watch Hamilton, you know what's up.
Thomas Jefferson always hesitant with the president, sitting there useless as 2 shits. Hey, turn around, bend over, I'll show you where my shoe fits.
They didn't like each other. Thomas Jefferson was kind of like the guy that you love to hate. Alexander Hamilton had a problem with him. I think you'll see that John Adams also had a little bit of a problem. So TJ really liked to stir the pot. This is so sticky. Thomas Jefferson really kind of got mad at George Washington a lot because George Washington would always kind of side with Alexander Hamilton on two main things. So the first thing was that Thomas Jefferson kind of didn't believe that the government should have like so much power, and then Alexander Hamilton wanted to establish a national bank and he wanted to like make sure the nation had credit and all this stuff. But Thomas Jefferson was like, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't want the government to have that much power, and I don't want the South to have to pay for the North's mistakes, basically, because Thomas Jefferson was from Virginia. He was a proud Virginian. But George Washington kind of saw it like, yeah, okay, but we need a national bank, we need national credit, we need other countries to take us seriously, so he sided with Alexander Hamilton, which pissed off Thomas Jefferson. This is really sticky. I'm kind of afraid it might stick in the pan, but you guys all watched me grease and flour it, so not my fault. I'm gonna stick this in the oven. It has to bake for an hour and a half, which is so long. So it's in the oven cooking. I washed out the mixing bowl and everything so that we can get started on the frosting. The next thing that they disagreed on was the fact that France was at war with England. Thomas Jefferson was an ambassador to France. He loved France. He was like, oh, every person who's lived anywhere else for like 6 months to a year, they're obsessed with it. Crack in a few eggs. Since Thomas Jefferson was an ambassador to France, he obviously wanted to side with France. He agreed that America was a little bit too new, a little too unstable, a little too broke to get into another long war. So he kind of agreed that they shouldn't flat out fight the war with them, but they should kind of make it clear that they're on France's side a little bit. Alexander Hamilton didn't think that, and neither did George Washington. They thought that it would kind of be more beneficial in the long run to kind of repair things with Britain, start to mend a little bit after the Great Revolution. They didn't take Thomas Jefferson's side on that issue either. So that really got him mad. He started to feel really outnumbered, really unsupported in the cabinet, so he resigned. He resigned as Secretary of State. So after Thomas Jefferson resigned, George Washington then signed something called the Jay Treaty, which really cemented the commercial ties with them and Great Britain. And this not only made Thomas Jefferson mad, but it made a lot of other people mad too, because they just fought this war with them and now they're kind of making deals with Great Britain. Like, didn't we just leave them? It's kind of like if you and your best friend spent like 6 years like getting back at this guy, and then your friend just like starts texting him again. Like, didn't we just do this? All these Republicans got so mad at Washington, and it kind of helped cement the Republican Party, which helped Thomas Jefferson get elected in the 1800s. I'm washing my hands. George Washington, he has some critics. One of them is a journalist by the name of Benjamin Franklin Benjamin Franklin Bache. Not to be confused with the other Benjamin Franklin. So he said this: "You seem to have entered life with a mind unadored by extraordinary features or uncommon capacity, that emitted none of the sparks of genius, however irregular and inconstant, which mark the dawn of your future eminence. Nature had played the miser when she gave you birth, and education had not been lavish in her favors." Benjamin Franklin kind of called George Washington an idiot, which probably kind of hurt George Washington because he was kind of insecure about his education. All right, Ben, hit him where it hurts. George, say hi. Look. Thomas Jefferson was pretty pissed that George Washington signed this treaty with Great Britain. He didn't think it was a good idea. He thought that George Washington was being stupid. So in a letter with one of his Italian friends, Thomas Jefferson kind of vented to his friend about how dumb George Washington was. He said that he subverted America to the harlot of England, saying, you know, he kind of like sold the soul of America to England after we just fought this war. This letter wasn't supposed to be published anywhere, you know, it never is. Don't write things down, people. Gossip the old-fashioned way. Don't write it down. Duh. This letter got around and George Washington saw the letter. It hurt him. He never commented on it publicly, but he also never ever talked to Thomas Jefferson again. Was Washington a little bit petty? Maybe. He bashed you in the news. Not cool. Not cool. Anyone would be mad. So all of this led to one of, I think, the greatest things that George Washington did as president, which was to give up power. In 1796, George Washington gave his farewell address where he gave up power. It was super unprecedented. Nobody knew what it meant to be a president. Everyone was only used to having a king, so the fact that somebody in power would give up that position willingly was pretty astonishing. And who knows, if it was somebody else who was the first president, what would happen? They would say if 2 terms was enough for Washington, 2 terms is enough for me. So if somebody else was president and didn't give up power, we could be living in a very different situation if they didn't have someone to look to like George Washington. So he gives the farewell address, and at 65, he returns back home to Mount Vernon for the rest of his years. I tried a little bit of the icing, and I think I may have used a little bit too much vanilla. I tried to do it said to use 2 tablespoons of rose water. So I used 2 tablespoons of vanilla. I think it might have been too much. I don't think I'm gonna like this cake at all. All right, so I got the cake here. I just took it out of the oven. It looks a lot more like bread. In 1799, he's riding his horse out in the cold by himself for a long time. He gets kind of sick. He gets super sick. The doctors try to save him by draining his blood and all of that stuff because that's how you did it back then, I guess. It didn't work. George Washington asked to let him go, so they let him go, and he died. He died shortly after that. George Washington died at home in Mount Vernon in 1799. It's not coming out. Oh, it came out. Came out in 1799. So shortly after this, really shortly after this, Thomas Jefferson gets elected as president-elect. He heard that George Washington had died. He wanted to go visit Martha, kind of pay respects to George. So he does this, and Martha, she says a few things that leads me to believe that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson never really got over it, and that George Washington hated Thomas Jefferson until the day he died. So after Thomas Jefferson went to go visit Martha Washington in Mount Vernon, Martha Washington said, "Next to the loss of her husband, Jefferson's visit was the most painful occurrence in her life. This election that he got elected in was the greatest misfortune our country had ever experienced." For Martha Washington, Thomas Jefferson being in the White House, well, there was no White House yet, was the worst thing America has ever experienced. Another thing that happens after George Washington dies is in his will, he makes it arrange for all of his slaves to be set free after him and Martha both die. Slavery is going to be a common theme in all of the presidents' lives up until and after Abraham Lincoln, I project. Washington kind of makes his views on slavery a little bit more progressive. Slavery is wrong, but he's also a man of his time. So he had slaves. Martha did set them free ahead of schedule. She set them free before she died herself. But I just want to make it clear that George Washington owned many slaves, and he was also very unwilling to let them have their freedom during his lifetime. One of his slaves named Ona Judge, she worked as Mrs. Washington's chambermaid. She ran away, and George Washington spared no expense. He put out extreme effort into finding her and capturing her because he didn't want her to have her freedom. He was unsuccessful in this. I don't know what happened to her. I just want to make it clear that George Washington, no matter how great everyone thinks he is, he still was a slave-owning founding father. All right, so it's done. It's been sitting for a while. Here we go, here we go. Here's Martha Washington's cake. It's a bit crumbly. It's a big piece. I don't want that big. Most of the wine is cooked out, but you can still definitely taste it. But the frosting did kind of balance out nicely with the vanilla. I don't feel the need to spit it out, which I thought I would. It's gonna be kind of gross. Ew. This is not gonna be good. I don't think I'm gonna like this cake at all. You know what? It's quite good. Now this is kind of like a holiday cake, so, perfect for December. Christmas is coming up. Maybe give Martha Washington's cake a try. So, We did a lot today. Most historians think that George Washington is one of, if not the greatest, American president ever. I think that if George Washington was not the first president who made it a custom to give up his power after 8 years, I don't know where we'd be. So, do I like George Washington as a president? Yes. George Washington. Is he as hot as Christopher Jackson? He's not. Thank you so much for watching, truly. I know it was a bit of a hot mess of an episode. Hopefully I'll get better. I am a new channel, so if you could like, subscribe, if you want to see more. I strive for historical accuracy, but I'm not perfect, and there is a lot of information out there, so if you have something to say, write it in the comments below. Be nice in the comments. Also, all of the links to my research and the recipe will be linked below. Also, a link to a podcast that I'm listening to called Presidential. See you next time for John Adams.